Hi, I'm Greg Davenport from JGD Prepared Service, and thank you for joining our vlog where we talk with the hero next door, people in our community who serve others, often without our knowledge. Today's guest is Jake Dutton, a fireman, paramedic, humanitarian, and personal friend. Jake and I go way back to 2015 when we provided medical care in Vanuatu, an island chain between Australia and Fiji, where a major tropical cyclone had just wiped out the islands. We've done several humanitarian trips together since then and have remained in close contact. Jake, how you been?
Good, Greg, thanks for having me. Looking forward to having this conversation with you.
It's great to have you here. When I decided that I was going to do this vlog, I really wanted to make sure that we focused on individuals who are basically neighbors that are doing significant humanitarian service, and we might not even know that it's happening. And I saw you as one of those people that would be a great individual to talk with and discover your background and what led you to do what you do today, which is exciting as far as I'm concerned. So let's go ahead and start with a little bit of a background so that we can understand who you are. Perhaps you could go as far back as your childhood, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what made Jake who he is today.
Yeah, sounds great. So I grew up in a small town in North Lake Tahoe, California. I'm from a working class family. My father still owns a masonry business in the Tahoe area. My mother worked a lot of different jobs to include being a pastry chef. She had a laundry service. I had one brother growing up, and our childhood was pretty normal. Growing up in Tahoe was pretty unique. It's a very unique place. You get a lot of adverse challenges living there, to include major winter storms. There's always a constant wildfire threat there, but nonetheless, a beautiful place to grow up. And it really gave me an appreciation for the outdoors and growing up in the outdoors. My father grew up in Squaw Valley, now known as Olympic Valley, also, which is in the same area. So he kind of did his best to give us the same upbringing that he got, basically hiking the mountains, skiing the mountains, showing us the outdoors, teaching us how to survive in the outdoors, all things that come along with living in a remote community in a remote area. So that was kind of what my early childhood was like growing up there. Like I said, I had a brother who unfortunately passed away 2014 in a skydiving accident, which we might get into a little bit more, as I viewed that as a big time catalyst for my need and desire to provide humanitarian service. Living in Tahoe was unique in the sense that we got to do other things that I think kids don't get to do normally growing up in areas that aren't like that, especially remote places. Our days were spent riding our bikes, playing with our friends, hiking through the woods. Our winters were spent not in daycare, but in ski programs where our parents would drop us off and we'd go do Mighty Mites at Squaw Valley. And that's pretty much how we kind of gained an appreciation for skiing, the outdoors. But that was just normal life for us. That was what it was like living there. And that's what it was like growing up there. And I lived there until I was 19 years old, and then moved to um, New York City.
It is interesting, I think, in how our childhood drives us, and sometimes we forget about that. It's the models in our early life that kind of push us forward as we get older. Growing up where you grew up, what a great place to grow up. I mean, people fantasize about growing up in places such as where you were. I would have loved to have lived in that area and had the opportunities that you obviously had as a child. It sounds like you had some issues with storms too. I mean, for me, I remember when we would have floods, I remember going out with my dad and filling up sandbags down at the riverbank to try to help the community. And it was a big deal. And it kind of was something that showed me at an early age what it was like to help others. And I'm sure as you had these events happen, they probably had you involved in some way or another. Can you tell me a little bit about any disasters that might have been specific or significant in your childhood that really burned into your inner being?
Yeah, I mean, we would routinely get severe winter weather, severe storms. The Sierra Nevada mountain range where Lake Tahoe is located is the first kind of elevation change for storms coming off the Pacific Ocean, pushing past San Francisco through the Sacramento Valley. So a lot of these storms would stall up there, and we would see heavy snowfalls, sometimes upwards of 6 feet within a few days. We'd lose power frequently. So we spent a lot of our childhood kind of navigating that stuff in the winter, where we would spend a week, if not longer, sometimes without functioning power in our homes. We'd be, experiencing snow days from school. The schools would be closed. And it really gave us a sense of community in the sense that it was kind of survival for yourself and survival for your neighbors at that point. As a community, we would often band together. And when I was really, really young, I remember we lived in a house that was in an avalanche alley. And whenever it would snow heavy, we would actually have to be evacuated and we would go to some friends' home. But I remember from a very young age sitting around their fireplace with no power, and we were evacuated from our home while our parents told us ghost stories and made up stories from, the community and stuff that they had heard in their childhood. And so that was something that was kind of unique in that we would spend time in the winter, just doing that and surviving with our friends and our neighbors and the close knit community that exists there in that area. But as far as like major disasters, I remember in 1997 we saw record snowfall up till Christmas. We got a ton of snow, and it snowed and snowed and snowed. And right after Christmas, while we were on Christmas break, it just started pouring rain, and it caused catastrophic flooding in the whole community. The lake was always at like a drought my entire life growing up. It was always low. I remember being able to walk out as a child to most of the areas underneath the docks. Even the docks that were built were not even at the water level. And as a kid, we would run out there and play around there and we'd search for things like arrowheads and things that we could find. And after 1997, when that happened, the lake all of a sudden filled up and was to full capacity. And I'd never seen that in my entire life growing up. It was kind of unique, but the catastrophic flooding that came with that and the destruction to the community was horrendous. My dad worked at Squaw Valley, which is now Palisades, Tahoe, and he worked in the race services department, and his office was up on the mountain a little ways. And I remember sitting in his office and it was just pouring rain and there was a river of water just breaking through the snow and washing all the snow away, essentially. It went from potentially being one of the greatest winters on record to one of the most catastrophic winters on record where all the snow just got washed away. And beyond that, I mean, one of my long-term role models and somebody I always looked up to is my uncle Scott McKinney. He was a firefighter and a paramedic also in the Sacramento area. And he also was an integral part of developing the urban search and rescue system in the United States. It actually happened in the late 80s was when the whole concept started that they needed a federal government response on to respond to catastrophic disasters. And things like the Oklahoma City bombing, I watched him respond to the Atlanta bombings, the Olympic bombings in Olympic Park. I watched him respond to September 11th, the catastrophic day here in New York City. I watched him respond to. And so that was something that kind of always drove me to serve too, where he was regularly responding to these catastrophic incidents throughout the nation. And I really looked at that as something that I was drawn to and something that I wanted to do with my life. And the way I wanted to live my life of service was kind of through those mechanisms. So watching him and remembering my mother kind of pacing the kitchen and panicking because her brother is at the Oklahoma City bombing while we're watching it on the news. And I was pretty young when that happened, but I do remember those instances in particular, those catastrophic incidences that happened to our nation and in our nation, massive catastrophes, loss of life, and an overwhelming desire to want to do that and be a part of that and respond to things like that at a young age. So
I visualize these storms where you lost power and where you guys played games and spent time as a family together. But I also visualize the survival techniques that went into that. You still had to maintain your body temperature, you still had to stay hydrated, and you still had to make sure that at some point, sooner or later, that you created some type of rescue, meaning that you were able to get resources to you or get out of that situation. So there were things that were going on in the background during that whole process that were so important for you. It sounds like you had some great role models too. And these were things that I was going to talk to you about, and we'll probably delve into a little bit more. But these role models, I think, play such a huge role in who we become as we grow up. And that's something we need to be aware of as parents and community members is our behavior and how we react plays a role in those coming up behind us. And it sounds like you had some great role models there. You've talked about how Oklahoma City bombing was an impact. You were very young when that happened, but you were older when 9/11 occurred. And we've seen other type of events happen, not just terrorist events, but natural disasters, of course, and industrial disasters. I mean, today, or within the last week, there's actually been an explosion up by Pittsburgh in a plant that is causing all kinds of chaos in the local community. And they've recommended that everybody within a mile radius of that hunker down in home, keep their doors shut, their windows shut. If they're running any type of HVAC, that they run it on recirc versus getting outside air coming in. So they're worried that there might be some contamination in that mile radius, although it's a small threat. But nevertheless, we've seen industrial accidents, not just 9/11, but we see industrial accidents, and we also see natural disasters. What role did those play? What role did 9/11 play for you as a 16-year-old young man in choosing your career path?
That incident obviously played a huge part in drawing me here to New York City and to seeking a career as a firefighter and a paramedic in public service. But I think that day was a catalyst for a lot of people to step up and rise to the occasion, especially my generation, where we didn't really have that leading up to that. Right. Like I said, there wasn't, with the exception of Desert Storm, there wasn't really any major conflicts leading up to like 9/11. And so whether you join the fire service, whether you join the military. I mean, I have friends that graduated a few years ahead of me that joined the military. And next thing you know, they are doing multiple tours in the Middle East now with a major Middle Eastern conflict happening. But I think that the overwhelming desire to serve and serve communities and provide service, I think was, what came out of that for me. I was already involved in the fire service leading up to that. I was a police explorer since I was 12 years old. So I was already drawn to public service in that sense. And I also was then subsequently an intern at the local fire department the 2 summers prior to September 11th. So I already knew that that was something that I wanted to do and something that I, wanted to be involved in. And that's how I wanted to spend my life working in public service. And then after September 11th and everything that happened here, I have friends that experienced that firsthand. They lost brothers, fathers, and a lot of them say if September 11th was the worst day, September 12th was the best day because communities banded together, the city banded together, and people came from all over to provide support and kept everything moving forward, really, like in the city. And I think that we're still in this post 9/11 era here now where you're seeing, people coming from all over to serve here and people coming from all over the world to come and work in this area and work in this city. And I think that for me was a major catalyst for making my decision in the end of the day that that's what I knew I wanted to do with my life. And that's what I knew, where I knew I wanted to be and where I wanted to spend my adult life working and learning and honing my craft.
I've been to New York, I don't know, maybe 8, 10 times in my life, and 3 or 4 of those are when I'm going there to fly out on a humanitarian trip. But I remember the first time I went there, I thought, this place is fun. I went to a Broadway play. I ate great food. Breakfast, lunch, dinner was phenomenal. It was busy as busy could be. And I said to myself, I could live here. This is pretty cool. By about the 4th time I was there, it was like I could come and visit for 2 to 3 days. So for me, I kinda took a different path with it. I found it too busy and a little bit overwhelming, and it was good for a vacation, but I needed a break from the, amount of stress that it seemed to pile on with how busy it was all the time. But I did love the food, I loved the culture, and the only time I ever felt threatened in New York was when I was walking back to the hotel from a Broadway play, and I found myself on a street where nobody else was. And all of a sudden, I realized the streets had been packed and now they weren't. And I thought, there's something wrong with this. There's no way that this street should be empty given everything I've seen up to that point. And I got nervous. I got a little nervous. I started paying attention to everything and I headed back to where I knew a major street was because I wanted to be back where people were, where I felt a little more safe. Whereas where I've grown up and so on, I've always felt safe to be alone and walking abandoned streets and so on. But there, I did not feel comfortable with that.
There's something wrong if you're all alone in New York City. That's a rare experience.
That's what I thought. I thought this ain't
There's
right.
always somebody there. There's always somebody right there.
I held my wife's hand a little bit tighter and said, "We need to move a little faster here." Probably no threat, but yeah, it was perceived nevertheless. So interesting that what led you there. But in 2014, you had a major loss in your family, and it was still pretty raw when we met in 2015. Could you, if only if you want, can you maybe tell us a little bit about how that's played a role in your desire to help? Because it's often, as somebody who's experienced loss, a child, a death at a young age, I understand the impact that this has on our lives and how it can either throw us in a downward spiral or it can be a catalyst to create positive change, or possibly both, depending on where we're at as we go through this grief cycle. If this is something you don't mind talking about, can you tell us how that might have played a role in who you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2014, April 29th, my younger brother, 27 years old, was killed in a skydiving accident. He had a midair collision, and he was doing something kind of technical skydiving. A little bit of background on him. We grew up the same, obviously. When he was a teenager, he ended up getting really into skiing, professional skiing, like freestyle type skiing. Big mountain free skiing wasn't really a thing at the time, but he was interested in like aerial acrobats and things of that nature. And he went away to a winter school in Utah where he would go to school all summer and then be able to ski all winter and not have to do schoolwork and things of that nature. But along with that, he ended up succumbing to addiction. He very quickly started changing his behaviors and things like that. And we kind of immediately, as a family, noticed that he was suffering from addiction. And he had a really rough road with that up until throughout the remainder course of his high school career, and even as a young adult, several times landing himself in jail, but eventually got his life back together. But he replaced his addiction with doing extreme sports. And at the time, big mountain free skiing had kind of gained a lot of notoriety. Growing up, we watched people like Shane McConkey and others kind of just dominate the mountains. Like they all skied at Squaw Valley where we grew up, and you could spend your whole day on the mountain just following these guys around and watching them do like backflips off of huge cliffs and just really pushing the limits. And over time, it started to gain more notoriety, that community in the ski industry, much like snowboarding did for a little while. Like I remember growing up and you weren't allowed to snowboard at certain ski resorts. Like it wasn't allowed. It was considered like the rebel sport. And I think big mountain free skiing kind of became an outlet similar to that for skiers, where it was kind of looked at as kind of like a rebel sport a little bit, but like these guys doing crazy, insane things. And eventually, like my brother worked his way into that community and got involved doing big mountain free skiing professionally. At the time, he had kind of sobered up, and a friend of his had gotten into the World Freeride Tour, and there was a qualifying race happening. And one of the other people that were doing it ended up getting injured and had to drop out. His friend was like, "Hey, listen, like this guy can't make it, but I know somebody else that's really good. Can he maybe take his spot?" And after some convincing, they were like, "Yeah, all right, sure, no problem." And he ended up going to the event and winning, and that was like the division event. And he went on to several other events and ended up winning United States and ended up on the Freeride World Tour, where he ended up becoming the number 1 big mountain free skier in the world for several years in a row. And with that, along also, he started getting involved doing things like base jumping, skydiving. He was in several movies. He kind of got intertwined in that crowd of people. He was in the Godzilla movie doing all the skydiving for that. He did a Pirelli tire commercial, which was pretty awesome. But he got involved doing a lot of that stuff. And as extreme sports kind of trickled in and became more and more popular, you started to see a lot of these younger kids pushing the limits more than probably would be acceptable in most instances, because that's the only way you can really make a name for yourself, right? If somebody else is doing, something, then you have to do more than them, and you have to continue to push and push and push and push. And that's how you gain notoriety in that community. I was very close with my brother growing up. We were 18 months apart, and he was my best friend for sure growing up. And we fought just like brothers doing stuff. But it's funny now because I have two little boys that are like almost the same age range that him and I were. And I just feel like I just see so many similarities between the two of them that, like that we had. And I remember, and now looking at my youngest look up to his big brother. And I remember that, like my younger brother looking up to me and wanting to do everything that I did. And, and then to watch him go on and become like this famous big mountain free skier. And it was really cool. And I was really, really proud of him and really happy for the life that he led. His life could have ended way differently for sure. There was a period of time there where we thought we'd find him dead in a parking lot, with a needle in his arm. And what he did with his life and how he transformed his life and got over his addiction was remarkable. I mean, he did a complete 180, but he filled that void with extreme sports. And unfortunately, the consequences of extreme sports can sometimes be catastrophic. And that's what we experienced with Tim and as a family. And it's something, that we still live with today. And obviously super hard on my parents. I realized that, time is limited in this world, and you got to do all the things that you want to do. Like, what's your life going to look like when you look back on it? What you do with your time is what matters. And so that kind of drew me more to the desire to serve in the capacity of humanitarian aid and as a humanitarian versus what I was doing already and giving back to communities and giving back to people. And I joke with my wife all the time. I kind of just became a yes man after that. Like, I wanted to do everything. And that's kind of what drew me into being a humanitarian and meeting you, Greg, and all the things that we did. And that's what I did with my feelings and I kind of bottled that up and turned it into action, I guess would be the best way to put it. And that's what I think he would want me to do. And that's what I wanted to do with my life. So that's where we're at now.
I know he's very proud of you. But I would say this. I think you're an adrenaline junkie too. And, you did not take the easy path. You did not take the alternative. You run towards danger. As a fireman, you run towards danger. As a paramedic in the most dense city we have in this country, you go into situations that put you at risk. So you may not be parachuting, paragliding, and all these other things, at risk type behaviors that we assume are at risk, but you and your daily chore, your daily job are doing adrenaline associated at risk behavior.
That is true. And my parents have always brought that up, and they bring it up that, like, like you guys both did risky things. I don't really look at it that way. I certainly view jumping out of planes a little bit different than what I do on a day-to-day basis, but you're absolutely right. Certainly drawn to adrenaline, drawn to excitement. It is exciting, and it's been some way to live a life. That's for sure. Like,
Right, right. I
it's,
look back at my military time, and I've lost quite a few friends in parachuting accidents, helicopter accidents, forestry penetrator accidents, airplane accidents. And, when we enter into those type of arenas, these things can happen. Without question, your day-to-day job, it's got risk.
I mean, we could have a whole conversation about navigating risk and my views on that.
That is a whole conversation.
I agree. I agree with you that you're right. Like, there is into that there, but
It's like when
it's
you're rappelling, you know, you're making sure that your anchor's set, all your knots are right, and your lines in the way it should be before you go anywhere. If you have a belay system in place, you make sure that those knots are right. You make sure your belay person's ready. I'm sure that when you're doing your duties as a fireman and paramedic in these high risk arenas, you've got backdrops that you guys have gone through that have prepared you for potential risks. And if they occur, hopefully those backdrop behaviors come into play and you walk out of that, you know,
sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that like where I work now, I work in the special operations company in Manhattan. So there's one special operations company or one rescue company in each borough, and I work in the one that covers Manhattan. And I was, like I said before, just being drawn to New York City, like always being drawn to the big city, to the center of the city. But it's such a challenging place to work. I mean, the things that we face on a regular basis, from technical rescue, things like doing high angle rope rescues, to the fires that we go to are usually extremely complex, to scuba diving in the rivers, to all that stuff. We do navigate a lot of risk, but I think that we do a very good job of preparing ourselves to navigate that risk, especially as like a small unit. And how we navigate those things, we drill endlessly. We're constantly practicing. We're constantly throwing different types of scenarios at each other to see how we're thinking. The company officer of this company gets to handpick his 25 members of the company from the 11,000 uh, personnel firefighter pool of the New York City Fire Department. So it's a pretty big honor to get to work in a place like that. That being said, like, you're getting to work with the best of the best. The guys that I work with are hands down the best firefighters and technical rescue experts that I've ever had the privilege of working with. They're hands down able to navigate some of the most severe and complicated types of situations that we face in the city on a regular basis. And that's been probably one of the greatest honors of my life, is serving amongst those guys, and just getting to work with like-minded individuals and guys that are so good at their craft and what they do. But I think along with that comes a greater ability for us as a team to navigate risk and to navigate curveballs and things of that nature. We are kind of the last line of defense in the New York City Fire Department in a lot of respects. There's nobody coming after us, so we need to figure it out and we need to solve the problem. And that comes if we're rescuing our own members operating at fires or emergencies, or if that comes in the form of us rescuing civilians. And
You and the team members are the elite individuals or team for the Manhattan community. And that probably makes you one of the most elite firefighter paramedics in the United States just because of all the issues that arise in that Manhattan arena. So that's impressive. You have brought yourself from this 19-year-old who moved to Manhattan, not knowing our New York area, not knowing anybody at all, to somebody who has now reached probably one of the highest levels you can hit in that fire department. That's pretty cool, Jake. That's really cool. And you deserve to be commended for that accomplishment. I mean, and you're still young. There's a lot to come with you yet. We've gone through your life history, your childhood growing up in the mountains, and skiing and all these outdoor activities, a few disaster arenas that occurred, and then at 19, you took off and you went to the big city. You became a paramedic, a fireman. You traveled around the world doing a couple different things, to include a month-long trip to, I believe it was Egypt, where you were at a wedding and doing things like that. You met your wife, salsa dancing. You chased her all over the world. You've been very successful in your career as a fireman and paramedic, and life's really good. Why volunteer to do global humanitarian work that takes you into areas where you present new risk, such as what you've done in your humanitarian work around the world? Can you tell me about your first trip and why you took it?
yeah, so to go back a little bit, 2010 was kind of like my first real desire to want to serve in that capacity. And before that, I would say right after I moved here, Hurricane Katrina happened. It decimated New Orleans. I was a new paramedic at the time in paramedic school. The fire department here was sending people down there to go help and assist. And that was kind of like my first real desire to, like, man, that's something really cool. That's something I would like to do. Fast forward, I'm going through paramedic school at St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan, which is now closed, unfortunately. And there was a group of paramedics there that were affiliated with the hospital, and also they worked at St. Clair's or St. Vincent's Midtown Hospital. Phil and Joe Connolly and all those guys, that Chris Summers, they had um, decided that they were gonna start their own humanitarian group after responding to Pakistan for the massive earthquakes that happened there. I believe it was at 2005,
Yeah,
sometime in that range.
I know the whole story, but I can't remember what year it was. And they just kind of showed
Steve
up.
Ruth.
They just kind of showed up and did their thing. And
Yeah, and I remember at the time, like, them coming in and just, like, scrambling for supplies and raiding the supply closet and, grabbing stuff, and they went to Pakistan, and
great
I
group, great group, great group of people. I mean, wonderful people taking on a great mission. Yeah.
yeah, but at the time, I was like, "Man, that's, like," I mean, moving to New York City for me, like, really opened my eyes to, like, how small the world is, I think, and, especially going to Egypt and then doing a lot of traveling on my own at the time, and I was like, "Man, like, there's people there that need help." And there was a 60 Minutes piece done on their trip to there, and, seeing what they did, what they were able to accomplish, and knowing some of them, I was like, that's a group of people I want to be affiliated with. I want to I want to hang out with these guys. Like, I want to go around the world and help people. And then 2010, the Haiti earthquake happened, and they again responded. Our FEMA USAR team from New York Task Force 1, also responded to the Haiti earthquake, and that was also an instance where I was like, man, I want to be involved in responding to things like that in some capacity. And like I said before, like watching my uncle respond to major incidents like that around the country. I was too young to remember this, but in 1985, there was a massive earthquake in Mexico City. People were trapped in the rubble, and my uncle at the time had a live fine canine, and he responded with a bunch of his buddies from California. They got in pickup trucks and drove to Mexico City and started digging people out of the rubble. And that too provided a catalyst for them to develop the urban search and rescue system here in the United States, saying that, California in particular is extremely susceptible to massive earthquakes after we experienced Loma Prieta, things of that nature. Watching these guys do that, hearing their stories and watching the impact that they had, I was like, man, I want to do that. And at the time, there really wasn't any other humanitarian organizations doing things like that. Like, these guys were pioneers. And not only were they pioneers, they kind of wrote the book that about humanitarian assistance, about through the United Nations and the World Health Organization, the types of teams that can respond and provide medical assistance and things of that. Like, that didn't really exist at the time. There wasn't any huge formal framework. And these guys, and with like the help from Kathy Bequeri, like they really transformed humanitarian aid, especially like a small mobile medical team aimed to address remote communities that would otherwise go underserved. And that was a big part of the core mission values of that organization. And I wanted to be a part of that. I was like, man, I'm in on that. I want to go around the world. I want to go to disasters and I want to help people in their time of need and go to these remote communities. And being that I grew up in a very remote place and was accustomed to the outdoors and navigating a lot of the challenges we could face in the outdoors and, camping, sleeping in the dirt, finding shelter, finding food, finding water, things of that nature. Like, that was all stuff that I had kind of been exposed to my entire life growing up in Northern California. And I was like, kind of felt like this is going to be the best of both worlds. Like, I'm still going to get to use that skill set and the things that I learned growing up in the outdoors. And now what I know now from being, learning and being surrounded by some of the best pre-hospital care providers in the world and taking what we learned from here and applying that and giving that to other communities throughout the world. So that
You know what
was,
I call this group you're talking about? I call them the Marines of rapid response in disaster settings, because they are there and they're there quickly. And their whole goal is to deal with the immediate crisis. Whereas a lot of rescue teams will spend 3, 4 weeks doing background and research and coordinating different types of things before they get there. And unfortunately, that long delay could make a big difference in the morbidity and mortality of people involved in these disasters. So, New York City medics, let's just say who they are, has a strong history for me of being the Marines of disaster response. They're there, they try to be there as quick as possible, and they make a huge difference in people's lives that otherwise might have been left unserved for another week or two.
yeah,
Good
no,
group.
absolutely. And I just, I was drawn to that mission set. And so I had dabbled doing kind of like loosely doing humanitarian work. I did a trip to the Dominican Republic with an organization called Waves of Health, and they provide chronic care resources to an area called Dahabon, and I guess it would be Western Dominican Republic, right on the Haitian border. And they made several trips down there a year to provide chronic care and clinical needs to the community, taking care of people's, things like diabetes and hypertension and things of that nature. So that was my first real humanitarian trip. And after that, I had gotten back and still wanting to be involved doing this somehow. An opportunity arose, and 2013 Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines and completely decimated the Philippines. And to this day, I always say like that was the most destruction I've ever seen in my entire life. And that was even after going through Hurricane Sandy here in New York City, being on the front lines of that night when the storm hit and really created havoc in New York City and parts of Long Island and the Jersey Shore area, but Typhoon Haiyan was I believe the sustained winds in the hurricane were well over 200 miles per hour. I mean, it looked like somebody just taken their hand and slammed it down on these communities. The water surge hit in the middle of the night. There was endless stories that people had of their children being ripped out of their hands and gone forever. I've never seen palm trees decimated that way. I always use that as a gauge now when I'm responding to a hurricane. Like if I can see like a palm trees still standing and maybe the leaves are gone, it kind of gives me a gauge of like how severe the storm was. And in Haiyan, like the palm trees were ripped out of the ground and overturned, and there was nothing left standing. And so we responded pretty quickly, pretty immediately at the time. I was newlywed, and my wife supported me going, knowing that this is something that I wanted to do. And before I knew it, we were on a plane to South Korea, and then from there to Cebu in the Philippines, and we ended up in Eastern Samar in a city called Guiuan, which is about the population of 70,000 people, I believe, live there. And there was 100% destruction. And we were flown in on military aircraft from Cebu, and we just got to work. We ended up building clinical sites in the community. We ended up linking up with the United States military assets that were there, and they were flying us every day on helicopters to different islands that were affected. Overall, it was just like everything I had hoped the experience would be. We helped so many people. It really opened my eyes to what like humanitarian aid is, what it means, what we need to do when we get there. We were able to I think the overall understanding of humanitarian aid, especially in the medical community, comes in the form of let's go there and treat medical problems and treat people for their ailments and their traumas and their. I think that the reality of it is you're going, especially in like these smaller units, these small humanitarian groups, you're going into these communities that most likely had extremely limited resources to begin with and probably had humanitarian need on a good day. And now they've lost any kind of infrastructure that they've had. They've lost communications. They've lost their ability to feed themselves, to have clean drinking water. And I think that is more beyond the medical care that you can provide, but helping communities reestablish those connections, the thing to their essential services that they need. Very quickly to me became clear that that was the mission in these areas. It's one thing to come in and provide medicines to people that need medicines for their chronic illnesses, or to suture wounds, or to, clean wounds, things of that nature, provide medications for chronic disease, provide medications for emergency issues, medical and trauma issues that people are having. But none of that really means anything if we can't eventually get these people consistent services, right? So, that kind of became evident to me early on that like that was the mission, and that was something that we spent a great deal doing. Is in an effort to respond into these communities and leave them better than they were, like how do we reestablish pathways of communication and connection, and how do we reestablish people's ability to get their chronic need medications? How do we reestablish pathways for them to get medical care? How do we reestablish pathways for them to get food? And I found myself not necessarily going into these communities doing a great deal of medical care as a paramedic, but more so focusing on things like that, where how do we reestablish these pathways? And I think that translated and fast forwarded through all the subsequent disasters that both you and I went to and beyond, whether that be in Vanuatu or Nepal, where we spent a great deal of time not only treating people, but also trying to reestablish those critical pathways to leave them with something beyond what we could provide them for in the immediate aftermath of a disaster.
I think a lot of people get confused about, you know, this whole process in the respect that they do think that you're going in and taking care of orthopedic injuries, soft tissue injuries, potential other traumatic type events or things that have happened to individuals. But we fail to realize that they have to maintain body temperature, they have to stay hydrated, and the body requires certain medical needs be met, especially for those with chronic diseases or processes. So anytime, and I've been an advocate or a sayer of this forever, is that you can respond to a global health setting without any disaster medicine experience. But you cannot respond to a disaster setting without some know how in global health. And the reason for that is you've got to know how to keep that body temperature at its right level. You got to know how to keep them hydrated. And you've got to be able to sustain not only that, but sustain issues of chronic disease treatment for these people. And a lot of times, if we go in as a one time trip, we fail to see the long term implications that this disaster has. If it's totally devastated the area, as you said, you spent a lot of time trying to reestablish these types of things. But if it's totally devastated the area, it takes a long time to get clean drinking water. It takes a long time to establish shelters that keep that personal protection at its proper level. And it takes a long time to reestablish clinics. And then the question is, are people willing to do that? And it does a lot of times fall on the volunteer community to help in that respect. It's interesting. When we were in Vanuatu, do you remember seeing other teams in these remote islands? Other teams would come in and they had a very specific thing that they were coming to do. And I remember this one group that came in to provide drinking water to all these little islands, and they brought in these huge filtration devices that they could put their water in, and it would filter for quite a long time. And then they would have filters that they could replace it with. And it might have lasted them for a couple years. Of course, they would need ongoing replacement of those filters for long term type processes, but it was getting them through that first year or 2 years of making sure that their drinking water was okay. And there were other teams that were coming in to do similar things on different areas. I think it requires a community of volunteers to make this happen. Whereas one team might be coming in just for the medical side, another team might come in for this or that. But nevertheless, it doesn't matter. You're still overlaying no matter which
Sure, yeah.
team you're on. I mean, when we were in the mountains in Nepal, do you remember we would come upon homes that were made out of rock, and they were basically leveled down, and the people were rebuilding them, and we would stop and help them rebuild their homes. We weren't there to do that. We were there to travel from village to village and assess damage of individuals, treat what we could, and if it really needed to get out, try to arrange some type of method of getting them out of that area. And it wasn't via car because there was no roads. Remember, you'd take a helicopter coming in, and that was a lot of effort in its own right, as the first helicopter dropped us off and said they weren't going to come back. And long story there, isn't there? Nevertheless,
Yeah, I mean, like the old adage of like hurry up and wait. Like I remember, we had gone to Vanuatu, I believe, in March of 2015, and then April 10th, I believe, was when the Nepal earthquake happened. So we had only been back from in the U.S. maybe like a couple weeks,
right.
if not. And I remember getting the phone call of like, "Hey, can you go to Nepal tomorrow?" And we're like, "Yeah, sure, we'll get on the first flight." And I remember you came into New York and spent the night at our house on our couch and
I
our
did.
tiny little apartment, and then we we packed it up, and next thing we know, we're in the Middle East, and then short John over to Nepal. And I had never been to Nepal before, but like that's one thing too that I feel like I've gotten out of humanitarianism besides, the reward of getting to help people is, it's given me a very interesting view of the world, and especially certain places. Like I would have never gone to Vanuatu if I wasn't there to provide humanitarian aid. I didn't even know Vanuatu existed.
Right.
I had to look it up on the map. I remember when they called and said, "Hey, can you go to Vanuatu?" And I said, "Where is that? I have no idea where that is. I've never heard of it." And they're like, "Well, you're gonna have to fly to Australia, and then it's 4 hours back into the South Pacific, and it's a small island chain, and it got decimated by a cyclone." And I'm like, "Okay, sure. Like, let's do it. Let's go." And at that time, just the sense of adventure and, like, being away. And like you said, like we think in that period, especially in the period of, the greater organization kind of writing the book for small mobile medical teams responding to disasters and accessing remote communities, you know, we were doing that, and we were successful at that. And there was a need.
So one of my favorite pictures, I mean, I have many memories of Nepal. I remember when the 7.3 earthquake hit while we were standing on like a 30 to 45-degree slope. And it was just shaking. We were moving 3 feet one side to the other for about a minute. But one of my biggest memories of Nepal is you carrying this kid who has a cast on his leg, and it's from mid thigh all the way down. And it's just filthy dirty. I mean, I've seen these types of things in Iraq, where a cast is put on by somebody and 6 weeks later they show up, with this filthy, dirty cast, never been seen again. But I didn't expect that in the mountains in Nepal. There was no vehicle access. They didn't have really any medical care there. I believe they had some fee for service people that wouldn't see anybody if they couldn't pay. But nevertheless, you had a kid who had a cast on and you were carrying this child. What is the story behind that? I've always wondered, where did this kid come from? And, what did we do for him? Because I was in my own little world doing my stuff, but I remember seeing that. And also, I've got a picture of it. But what's the story with that? Where did this kid come from?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, like in a lot of the instances going to these remote communities, people hear that there's help or there's services, and people make great effort to come and get to you and find you, or come and grab you and say, "Hey, I know somebody that needs help. Can you come and look at them?" Which is, we had that experience there as well, caring for that elderly woman that was trapped in a collapsed building and had massive trauma to her lower
Yes,
legs, infection and stuff like that,
that was fun to
with no
see.
way to get her more definitive care or more definitive services. We were extremely completely isolated up there.
Yeah.
Like you said, they basically told us, we're going to drop you off and we don't know when we can pick you up, kind of situation. And we didn't get picked up for about 10 days later, I don't think.
And not by them.
And so I think, that was an example of, I think, a mother that was desperate. And I think that her child had a leg injury prior to the earthquake, and now them not being able to get access to critical infrastructure that they had before, like running water and things like that. She wanted us to evaluate her child and see if he even needed that cast on still. And I grabbed Chris Summers, I remember, and he kind of did an evaluation and tried to get a good gauge and how long the cast had been on, and it had been on for a significant period of time, likely
It,
more longer than it needed to be, but there was nobody there that could actually remove it. So we went on and cut it off for him, basically. We used shears and slowly but surely cut layer by layer by layer.
but it was an old plaster material, as I recall, right? It wasn't the fiberglass; it was the old plaster.
Yeah, but I remember I used a Leatherman tool, and we cut through it and sawed through it, and trying to be careful not to cut his leg and remove his cast. But again, it was just a case of that there was no services available to them up there to receive care, and there's no way to get out all of the normal pathways. I mean, all the roads were gone. I don't know if you recall that, like, and we even tried to access other remote communities, and every time we went out, we just encountered another landslide that had completely wiped out any kind of trail or road infrastructure. Traversing would have been extremely dangerous. Like, we didn't have rope systems, but at the time we were like, that would have been ideal to have ropes and stuff to traverse those and gain access. But it was very much a case of like, okay, well, what's on the other side of this? Is it even, it's going to be more landslides. And even after the second earthquake happened, which was about 7 days into our time up there, 7.3, and watching the landslides come
Yeah,
down,
they
and
were all
any
around us.
building,
They're all, it was coming down
yeah, and
everywhere.
any building that was partially standings was now not completely decimated. But I mean, that was the most powerful earthquake I've ever experienced in my life, like 7.3. And I think we were pretty close to the epicenter, but even,
Yeah,
knocked out satellite phone service. Like, we went from being able to make a couple calls a day to, like, we spent several days with absolutely
it was
nothing.
3 days. 3 days we didn't
Yeah.
have any
Yeah.
ability to call.
No way to communicate out anything. I mean, the only option I remember we were weighing at the time, we knew that it was gonna be a long, risky walk. There was still earthquake activity, but we would have had to trek, I think, upwards of, like, 30 miles to
Yeah,
get back
just to hit a
to
road that nobody
where
uses.
we could maybe, and we discussed that as a team. I remember, like, it's gonna be several days for us to be able to walk out of here. And it might come to that we're gonna have to walk out of here. But again, that goes back to the original part of the conversation, is like, that was, to me, when I envision humanitarian work, like, that's what I envisioned, right?
Right.
Like, being in the most remote communities in the world with people that need help the most. And oh, that was part of it. Like, we might have to walk 30 miles out of here, or we might have to, we ended up being able to charter a helicopter eventually, I believe.
Those little bitty ones, and I think a
Yeah, and
week
getting back
later,
to
one of them
Kathmandu.
ran into some power lines in Kathmandu, and everybody died on board. So wasn't our week.
Yeah, which is my going rate for helicopters in Nepal. I've flown in several that have subsequently crashed
Yeah,
several months, if not a year or so later. Especially in heli skiing there and stuff like that. Um, like definitely aviation is a tricky thing. And I don't know if you remember in Vanuatu, the plane incident.
I do remember the plane incident, the guy that was trying to take off with the wind to his back. Yes,
And
yes. He didn't
we
take
ended
off,
up
did he?
crashing the plane basically into the fence at the end of the cow field.
Yeah.
Well, everybody watched as we took off in a six-seater with six big guys in it. Like again, like that goes back to the conversation about risk and stuff like that. And that's one thing that I felt like, humanitarian work and how much risk you're willing to absorb. And obviously your work in Iraq, which I never went to Iraq, but I helped facilitate the entire project here stateside to include recruiting people to go over there and then coordinating everything on this end, which the services that we provided there as a humanitarian organization, I think were invaluable. It kind of, again, was a catalyst for developing a model of humanitarian aid in conflict zones. And that was something that several people in the organization went on to formally publish through the World Health Organization, the standards for humanitarian aid in conflict zones. And that again, though, too, was another example of, we brought medical care to the front lines as an organization, but the bigger part of that was establishing pathways for injured people to get more definitive care, right? Like that was the catalyst for the trauma stabilization point, was that the nearest hospital was over an hour drive away from the front lines of Mosul, and people were dying in that trip
And
from
that
Mosul.
whole hour was treacherous too, with the roads that were in ill repair, with a lot of big, huge, explosive holes that had been created, and there was problems with the chest tubes coming out because of the rough trek to get there and other issues. But not only that, there was this threat of combat occurring en route. I mean, we were right at the front lines, and we were there to help the civilians that were caught in the middle of the fighting. It totally floored me during a day to see kids out playing on the street, and then the next day to see that community get shot up. I mean, when the Iraqi forces that we were embedded with would move forward, we would go forward with them, and they would clear out that street. But before we went forward, ISIS was moving away, but they would leave snipers. And so not only were IEDs a big issue and explosive blast type injuries, but sniper or ballistic injuries were huge among the elderly and children that were coming out into the street once ISIS moved forward, as they left those snipers behind to take them out. So it was very devastating to the civilian community. I mean, a lot of damage to kids and women and old men and non combat adult males. Actually, I didn't see much of them, but nevertheless, and we took care of soldiers when it was appropriate too. But for the most part, they were taken care of by the Iraqi medics, and we were taking care of mostly civilians. Not always, but mostly civilians caught in that conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I that's to be honest with you, that's always like one of my biggest regrets is that I never got to go to the front lines in Iraq, and that was like a decision made for me by my family at the time.
Yeah, I think
Unfortunately, but I
one of the biggest regrets on the flip side of that coin is having gone to the front lines in Iraq. So this is a no-win situation. An adrenaline junkie wants to go and do this humanitarian work. They come home and then they have the visions they have to live with. So there's a flip coin to that too.
yeah, I mean that probably was the most uh intense humanitarian project I ever worked on. Like obviously the constant security threat. In theory, it was going to work out. Uh, when we even floated the idea of taking it on as an organization and what it looked like, like there was obviously tremendous amount of security concerns. There's a tremendous amount of thought put into, things like what if one of our humanitarian aid workers is killed over there, things like that, but fortunately we were able to pull that off and without incident, no major incident, nobody getting killed or injured. I think it lit a fire for a lot of people in the humanitarian community that were now drawn to humanitarian aid. I know multiple people that went on and it continued today to work and either run their own organizations or provide aid or humanitarian aid throughout the world because of their experience there
Right.
in Mosul. I also think like there's a fine line when it comes to the amount of risk you're willing to absorb in those types of environments. Conflict medicine is a lot different than just humanitarian crises caused by natural disasters, I guess so to say, where there's a constant threat out there aiming at that could potentially strike at any time or strike at any moment. It definitely changes the paradigm when it comes to that. And making those decisions is obviously up to every individual. But, like sending people over there was a little bit unnerving in the sense that it was like, if you're going to go there, I just realized that we can't guarantee your safety, which is often the case anyways when you're going on a humanitarian mission, especially going to areas. I mean, when we went to the Philippines at the time, that part of the Philippines was said to be heavily occupied by the Islamic State and Al Qaeda, Taliban. So there was grave concern, security concerns when we were over there, but never did we ever feel unwelcome or weren't ever led to be felt unsafe or anything of that nature. Everybody in the communities there was very happy to see us, was very happy to accept aid. And I think that that's something that I very much gained an appreciation for was over time going to these remote communities and navigating potential security threats and potential security issues and kind of creating a paradigm in my own mind of like how do we get into these areas and how do we get community buy-in and how do we maintain our team members being safe and and not have any critical security threats or security issues, because a lot of the times you're going into these places and we didn't know what to expect because people during this time period are probably experiencing one of the most vulnerable times in their life. And, vulnerable people do abnormal things. So, how can we guarantee? But I always found that, community buy-in was huge, and especially going to these remote areas and getting, community leaders involved in our presence and involved in the process and always worked to our benefit. We were always able to safely navigate. When we went and embedded ourselves in these communities and had community leaders with us representing us, they were always able to get organization in the community, get people help that needed help, not always absent of politics, unfortunately. In a lot of places you go, there's always politics at play. There's always going to be socioeconomic politics that play into aid being brought to certain areas versus others. It's not as cut and dry, I feel like, as we view healthcare here in the first world or in the United States. But there's a lot of stuff at play and there's a lot of stuff that you have to navigate. And for the size of the organization that we were, NYC Medics at the time, our impact was huge. I mean, we were a small organization and we were made up of, you know, ad hoc volunteers in most instances. And what we were able to accomplish when we were going to these places was tremendous. It was more than any of the other organizations were able to accomplish in their time in most instances. So that was one of the best parts of it. I guess, and what ultimately like kept me in it for as long as I did, and as long as I was involved in it. I mean, going to places, like we did a project in El Salvador during the height of the conflict with the gangs there to go train the police force to stop the bleed, basically. And, that was another interesting place that I was brought to at a time where it was the most deadly country on the face of the planet. There was more people being killed in El Salvador than there were in Iraq at the time. And, so getting to go there and help those communities and help them navigate some of their most extreme challenges was very, very rewarding. I wouldn't trade any of that time for that I spent doing that. Like it was all worth it. It was all worth my time in the end.
Jake, tell me where you live now.
We live in the Bronx, which if you don't know, New York City is the very top part of the city. And I live about 3 blocks from the city line that goes into Westchester County.
So you live in a house?
Yep,
Because I
we
know when
have a
I
private
visited you,
house.
you were
I
in
got a
it.
yard. I got chickens. I got a little Bronx farm going on here. It's abnormal for the Bronx, but our community is kind of like an isolated section of the Bronx. Basically, if you drive up the west side of Manhattan and keep going north, then you go over the bridge and you're in the Bronx. and you're in the community that we live in called Riverdale. It's a very great community, very great place to raise a family. Very strong sense of community, a lot of first responders and stuff that live up this way, teachers, a very tight knit community. So
Do your neighbors know you?
yes, yeah, we live on a small cul-de-sac, and we know all the people that live next to us.
Do they know anything about you?
Probably not. I mean, sometimes it might come in conversation, just traveling in the places that I've been in the world. But I'm a pretty reserved person, I guess, in general, kind of humble. Like I try not to talk about that stuff, or I don't want to make it sound like I'm bragging about it. It's easy for me to sit down here and have this conversation with you, being that we shared a lot of these experiences together. But yeah, I mean, I kind of keep a lot of that in.
Jake, you and I have known each other for a good 50, a good 10 plus years. I know that you are the hero next door, but the whole point in having this discussion with you and with others like you is that we all live in communities and sometimes we don't even know who our neighbors are. And I really think it's important that we see the impact that one individual has on a community, even though they're not out boasting about it, and that we recognize that we could do the same in one way or another. So if we can see the hero next door, somebody like you who's had this extraordinary life, who's devoted themselves not only in a profession but as a volunteer to serve through medicine and help others, if we can see that in you, maybe we can also emulate that. So I think the hero next door is more prevalent than people know, and we need to realize that they are around us and they are here, and we just might not know it. And I think your neighbors probably know you're a fireman, paramedic, but I doubt that they know all the heroic things that you've done and how you put your life at risk, not only in your job, but in your volunteer work to provide that service to people who otherwise would go without service. So I commend you as the hero next door. I'm proud to know you. I'm proud to be your friend. And I have really enjoyed talking with you over the last hour or so about your background and what led you into service, why you serve, and why I know that you will continue to have an impact on your family, your community, the state, and beyond. And hopefully, this short talk that we've had, for anybody who's listening, hopefully in some way it's inspired you to serve in one capacity or another. Thanks, Jake. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we close this up?
No, I appreciate the opportunity, Greg, and I often don't like talking about myself and don't like hearing myself talk on recordings. I too value your friendship and value the places that we've been together and the things that we've gotten to do. And you have always been somebody that I've looked up to. And I remember the first time we met when we were going to Vanuatu, and they told me like, yeah, there's a guy who's coming on the trip and he's written 6 books about survivalism. And, and I was like, okay, cool. And I was like, I remember we met and I was like, I think we just became best friends. I mean, the mentorship you provided me and the friendship, I'm forever grateful for. And I think that's another part of working in humanitarian work is just finding like-minded people and surrounding yourself with them and getting to build those relationships and meet people that view the world the same way that you do. And I think that's super important part of it also.
I agree. I agree with you. I feel the same way about you.